Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We have a busy day here. We're waiting for the live feed in the George Burch case at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But we're also previewing another case here on the network, and that's the Tex MacGyver case out of Georgia. So here you have a prominent attorney who is now charged with the murder of his wife. Now, here's the story. Tex MacGyver was sitting in the rear passenger seat of a car along with his wife, Diane, and he claims that the shooting was a tragic accident. He was holding a gun. He says he fell asleep with this loaded gun in his lap, and when the car stopped, he woke, lurched forward, and accidentally pulled the trigger, shooting his wife. Now, the state believes this was murder. Let's try to break it down about this murder-accident dichotomy. Again, I'm here with criminal defense attorney and prosecutor George, I was going to call you George Burch, Bob Bianchi. Yeah, you don't want to be George Burch. Bob, okay, break it down for me. Why, this maybe an accident, why was he charged?
Very hard to say, and the information that we've been given so far is very limited. But what we do know is that he was in the back seat, and what I find compelling, just odd, just a little trial lawyer oddness, is that the best friend's wife is driving the vehicle. His wife's in the passenger seat, and we know a shot was fired from the back seat from his weapon that he had, and his wife is dead. Now, I just find, as a prosecutor, remember, as a prosecutor, I'm always looking in a homicide case as to what the other side is going to say. What are they going to do, and what evidence can I gather as a prosecutor to refute would be the common sense arguments defendants would make. Jesse, don't ever forget, in the end, it's not about law school, it's not about college, it's not about being smart, it's about having common sense as a trial lawyer, so you're always anticipating what the other side's going to do. And the first question that comes to my mind is, this is really odd. The guy decides to murder his wife by shooting her with his best friend's wife driving the vehicle? This is not the kind of planned preparation or thing that a normal person would do.
Bob, I'll play devil's advocate here. If someone was going to commit a murder and kill their wife, maybe they wanted to make it look like an accident. You know, no one would suspect if I'm in the car with another stranger and, oh my gosh, the gun goes off, seems like a plausible story. His problem is this attorney, prominent attorney, there was very suspicious behavior after the shooting. Let's talk about that. Isn't that what nailed him?
Okay, so what he did was they're charging him with attempting to try to influence certain people to either not speak about the case. Now, again, you got to be careful as a prosecutor when you get this data, because there's lots of reasons that people tell people not to speak that are not just that they're guilty, but for other reasons as well, including the fact that he said, if you keep talking, they're going to wind up locking me up, these guys. So he's an attorney. He understands how cops operate. So, but yes, the prosecution is going to use that evidence to show what we call consciousness of guilt. In other words, he is aware and trying to tamper with these witnesses so that the case can't be built against him because he has something to hide. And the question is whether the judge and to what extent the judge is going to admit that other crime evidence. There's an evidence rule about this. How far is a judge allowed to introduce extraneous evidence outside the day of that particular alleged crime in order for the prosecution to not create reversible error, but that makes it relevant? And here the prosecutor saying this goes to motive, intent, and absence of mistake. These are quotes under the law. The prosecution is saying all of this stuff should be used so that we can show motive is the number one reason that evidence is allowed to be admitted under the law. I know I'm giving you a lot of law school stuff here, but
I
feel
back to evidence right now.
It's not a mistake, right? So, but the thing that's interesting here in this case to me, Jesse, from what I read, is that the prosecution hasn't given us a lot of data. It said they're going to prove their case through forensic evidence, which has to be the gunshot itself. In my experience, when a gun goes off, proving it through forensic evidence can be tough sometimes.
Okay, well, I never like to see these cases happening in general, but let alone an attorney who's in the midst of it. We're going to cover the Tex MacGyver case, but Bob, I really want to talk right now about the George Burch case real quick before we go to break. What I want to play right now is some testimony from yesterday. This is the testimony of Ed Jackson. Okay, and the reason this is important, he disproves a lot of the points put forward by the defense, namely that if George Burch was attacked by Doug Dietrich, he would have had injuries to his head. Let's listen in.
Did you have good luck on Sunday also?
Yes, we did.
On the drive back to your home, did the defendant bring up any unusual topics or indicate anything unusual taking place on May 20th or May 21st before you went fishing?
No.
Did there come a time following your fishing trip that you became aware of any news reports with respect to the homicide that had taken place in the Hoffman Road area?
On Channel 11 News.
You remember watching the news on TV, it was?
Yes.
Was anyone with you when you observed this?
A couple times, Linda, and also Steve.
You do remember the defendant being present in the room when the report came on?
Yes.
Did you happen to recall, was he there more than once when news was reported on this subject?
There was at least once or twice, yes.
And did the news reports, without going into it, did they go into some of the detail of to what had been learned at that point with respect to the homicide?
Yes.
Where would you have been watching this?
What do you mean?
Where were you, at your home?
Oh, yes.
What room?
In the living room.
Okay. And do you recall remarking when you learned about this murder, anything about the case itself?
Yes.
What did you say?
I said the scumbag that did it ought to be taken down.
Did the defendant have any response to that comment?
Not at all.
Did you notice his attention or his demeanor when these reports would come on?
He was pretty intensely looking at the TV.
On May 21st, at any point in time, either before you left your house, in the car, or on the boat with the defendant, did you notice any injuries to his head?
No.
Did you have a good view of his head during that time period?
Yes.
Didn't see any bruising?
No.
No swelling?
No.
No abrasions?
No.
No contusions?
No.
George Burch didn't have any injuries to his head, and he didn't react to the news of Nicole's death. Bob, what do you make of that?
Look, you know I'm a prosecutor at heart, and I'm a homicide prosecutor as a specialty. I'm not impressed by this testimony. I'm going to be honest with you. I know everybody is.
Oh, I am.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't think it means the prosecution is presenting this evidence, and if I were a defense lawyer, I'd be thinking as a prosecutor, defense lawyer's going to turn around and say, you get this guy up here, like he's really looking at the guy's head. What medical testimony, what expert came up here and talked to you about what injury they would look like in order to be knocked out? Because people can be knocked out and not have contusions to the skull. I know that for a fact, having had those cases. And as far as watching the TV.
Yeah, Bob. Well, at the end of the day, it's not up to us, it's up to the jury. We'll be back in a minute after this commercial break. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We are covering the George Burch case out of Wisconsin, a man who was charged with first-degree intentional homicide in connection with the death of a beautiful young mother out of Wisconsin, Nicole Vanderheiden. And from all accounts, from people who have testified, she really was a great mother, taken in the prime of her life. Now we're trying to decide who did this. George Burch, here's what we know. We know that George Burch's DNA was all over her body. We know that Nicole Vanderheiden suffered from blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation, and her body was found in a field 3 miles from her home. We also know that data from George Burch's cell phone indicates he was at 4 key locations that night, including the field where her body was found, near her home, and the highway where her clothing and purse were found. It seems like an open and shut case, except the defense is not refuting any of that evidence. They're saying despite all that evidence, he's not the one who did it, but that it was Douglas Dietrich, the man you see on your right there, that it was Nicole's boyfriend, Douglas. And that according to the defense, now the jury hasn't heard this yet, we haven't heard this in the trial, but we have heard this from previous moments in this case, that they are going to argue that George Burch had sex with Nicole that night outside of her house, and that he was knocked unconscious by Douglas Dietrich. And when he woke up, Nicole was dead, and he was forced by Doug at gunpoint to help dispose of the body. Process that theory for a second. Is it unbelievable? Well, what we heard yesterday was testimony from friends of George Burch, people he lived with, and what you hear consistently is that George didn't have any injuries to the back of his head, which is inconsistent with somebody that was hit and knocked unconscious. You also hear that his behavior after Nicole's body was found wasn't that unusual. Now, even if you want to say that this is a guy who killed her, and maybe he was hiding something, okay. But if a guy that was forced to get rid of a body and didn't say a word, that might have you thinking for a second. What I want to play for you right now is the testimony of Linda Jackson. This is the wife of Ed Jackson. Again, George Burch lived with both of them. And you can hear what she had to say about her roommate, George Burch. Take a look.
Fishing trip that your husband and the defendant took to Racine in May of 2016?
Yes.
You didn't go with them, is that correct?
No.
Do you remember if you saw them in the morning before they left?
Well, I know I saw Ed before and I think I went to work that day.
Okay.
I'm not really sure. But I know I wasn't home. But he always calls me and tells me he's going fishing.
Is that one of his favorite hobbies?
Absolutely.
Do you remember, were you working at all in your garden that morning, or do you remember what hours you went to work?
No, I don't.
Okay.
But I know that I got a picture from Ed because he finished my herb garden that day. I mean, the base. He put an herb garden together for me.
Oh, he sent you a picture of it?
Yes.
That's nice. Were you aware what time he took off? And if you weren't there, that's fine.
No.
Was the plan that he was going to be gone, leave Saturday, get back Sunday?
Yes.
Okay. And is that in fact what took place?
Yeah.
And the defendant was going with them, is that correct?
Yes.
Did you know the gentleman with whom they were going to go fishing with?
Yes.
And that's who?
Mike Hankey, A1 Charters.
You've met him before, is
Oh,
that-
yes. He's been a long-time family friend.
And you're friends with his wife also?
Absolutely.
Now, back in May of 2016, how would you describe the defendant's hairstyle?
Short. I wouldn't say his head was never shaven, but it was very, very short.
Very different than it is today, is that correct?
Yes.
Following their fishing trip, did they return to your house on Sunday?
Yeah.
Did you see both of them?
I believe so.
Did you notice anything unusual about the defendant's head when you saw him after the fishing trip?
No.
Notice any injuries to his head?
No.
Now, I thought that was pretty important testimony about really hitting into the defense's theory that George Burch didn't have any injuries. Didn't really impress my guest here, Bob Bianchi. So, Bob, I'm going to ask you this. Even though you take away that testimony, what the Jacksons also said was that they loaned Burch their car, the Chevrolet Blazer. Now, the reason that's important is, according to the defense, he was driving that at the time of Vander Heiden's death. And Burch is claiming that Douglas Dutry forced him to drive this Blazer to the road, to the field where Vander Heiden's body was ultimately found. But isn't there a problem with the Blazer? Where is it right now?
Now, I think that is a compelling piece of objective evidence. It's not subjective, communicated through its other party like the other evidence is. Obviously, the prosecution is going to tie that into the fact that he killed her in that vehicle and that he burned that vehicle and lied about that vehicle being stolen, which gets back to that phrase we always use, consciousness of guilt.
Because the vehicle could never be tested for DNA because it was destroyed before Burch became a suspect. Now, he claims that someone stole the car and took it away, but coincidence?
Jesse, I got to say, just from 30 years of doing this as a homicide prosecutor, I have seen people lie for all sorts of reasons that made them look guilty of committing a murder when in fact it was somebody else. Now, he clearly was involved here, and the evidence is overwhelming, don't get me wrong. But as a defense lawyer, or a prosecutor even, I'm going to be very, very cautious of this evidence because it could be that he disposed of a body, he was having sex with another guy's girlfriend, and he decided, like, hey, you know what, I'm not really on top of the world right now, I got no money, I don't need to be associated with this, I'm going to burn my vehicle. That's the argument the defense is going to make. And more compelling to me is that it's not that he has to prove anything to defend it. The state has to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Is it a big fact for the prosecution? Yes, but it can be interpreted in multiple ways.
What I think is very interesting is a lot of cases we cover here. You see sometimes, I'm not saying this is what happened here, but you see a lot of times people that are hiding things because they're cheating on a spouse, or maybe they're in this case, if we believe what George Burch is saying, he was the one that Nicole was cheating with. They hide so much so they don't get caught cheating.
Right.
When it really looks bad in a murder case.
I've seen this happen. And by the way, I've also had one or two cases in which people participated in disposing of a body having been threatened by somebody to do it, even though they weren't even at the crime scene when the murder took place, and made it appear as if they were the people that were involved in the murder itself. But you are right. So one of the best detectives I ever worked with was just a really great guy. He had common sense. He used the rule of reason, but he would say all the time when he trained his other detectives, and I used to love watching him take statements, is that you have to pierce through why they're lying. The mere fact that they're lying for all sorts of reasons, gambling debts, infidelity, embarrassment, social standing, may make them look guilty, but you got to make sure that those lies are because it's consciousness of guilt as opposed to trying to avoid being exposed for some other thing.
Bob and I are talking about the George Burch case. We expect a live feed any moment. As soon as we have it, we're going to make sure to go into that Wisconsin courtroom. We don't want you to miss any of the testimony because we believe the state will rest their case today in a day where we believe it's going to talk about George Burch's cell phone, pinpointing him to key locations that night, including the crime scene, and where Nicole's body was found. And we also believe that there is going to be testimony about the Fitbit data tracking where Douglas Dietrich was that night. Now, Bob, we were talking in the break that we have this evidence of George Burch's cell phone, but what is there to really track Douglas Dietrich? Because we think that the Fitbit data can track the amount of steps he took, but it's not entirely clear if that can pinpoint his location.
To me, this is a very significant piece of evidence. And remember, this prosecution is somewhat flawed. It's not impossible to win, having arrested the boyfriend first and having him as a suspect. Now, they used the defendant, Burch's phone, in order to place him at various locations. And even though the defense has an explanation for it, that evidence is very powerful, it's objective, and it doesn't lie. My question, Jesse, what I was asking you offline is, did they do the same thing with Burch's cell phone?
Dietrich's cell phone.
Dietrich's cell phone, rather. Did they analyze that phone, or did they just say after they unarrested him, hey, you know what, he's no longer our suspect, so we're really not going to dot our I's and cross our T's, we're just going to use Burch's phone? And if they did that, or if they didn't do the phone with the boyfriend, then that is a big problem, and a defense lawyer at the end of the case is going to argue that it's a lack of evidence. And Jesse, you know this, and your viewers should know this too. At the end of every criminal trial, a judge tells the jury that you can find a person not guilty based on the evidence or lack of evidence. If there was something that the state should have done and they didn't do, that alone can create reasonable doubt. If you're going to do Burch's cell phone, then why wouldn't you do his cell phone? And that's going to be, to me, a major problem if they didn't do it. And right now, we don't know if any information is going to come forward about them having looked through his cell phone.
Well, maybe the defense will do something when they take up the case. And again, we talk about the defense's theory here that George Burch was sleeping with Nicole Vanderheiden the night of her disappearance and murder. But there's one person that might not be too happy about that, and that is Jordan, George Burch's girlfriend. She testified yesterday, too. It was a day filled with friends that knew George Burch. So what I want to play for you right now is the testimony of Jordan, and you can listen in and hear what she had to say about George Burch at the time of this incident. Take a look.
But you actually were with him on a pretty daily basis throughout a week?
Yes.
Did you know where he was living?
Yes.
Where was he living?
He was living with Ed and Linda over off of Broadway, kind of. I forgot what street it was on.
Okay. And was that the Jacksons?
Yes.
Did you ever go to that home?
Yes.
And you got to meet the Jacksons?
Correct.
Did he ever come to your home?
No.
Was that on Greenwood Avenue, if you recall, his residence with the Jacksons?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Did you consider yourself being in a close relationship with Mr. Burch?
I thought so, yes.
Do you remember there being a time that Mr. Burch told you that he was going to go on a fishing trip?
Yes.
Did you know with whom he was going?
With Ed and like another boy, I think, or something.
Okay. Were they heading down to Racine?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
Did you go with him?
No.
Do you know if Linda was going with?
No, Linda was not going with.
Okay. And do you remember, was that a weekend trip they were going to take?
If I remember correctly, yes.
Okay. Did you, on the Friday before he was leaving, did you see him on that occasion?
We were talking, and I'm pretty sure I hung out with him in like the morning.
But not the evening, is that correct?
No.
I'm sorry, I put that badly. Were you with him in the evening on that Friday?
No, not the evening.
Okay, and you had expected him to be gone that weekend, is that correct?
Correct.
While he was gone, did you find out, did he in fact go fishing? Did you see any pictures or anything?
Yes, he sent me a picture to my phone of him catching a fish.
Okay. And was that something that he would normally do, keep track of what he was doing and send you pictures sometimes?
Yes.
Did you see him when he returned after the fishing trip?
Yes.
Do you remember, did he come back that Saturday or did he come back Sunday, if you remember?
I don't remember exactly, but I do remember seeing him after the fishing trip.
And it was right after he got back, is that correct?
I would say maybe a couple hours, and then I came over and seen him.
Okay. Now, was his hair pretty short back then?
Yes.
Did you notice anything about his head, anything unusual?
No.
Did you see any injuries, any bruising, abrasions to his head?
No.
Did you continue to stay in your relationship with him through May of 2016?
Yes.
Okay. And did your relationship continue, this romantic relationship, in June and July and August of 2016?
Yes.
Did you still see him pretty much every day or stay in contact with him very regularly?
Yes.
Okay. And then you were aware he was arrested in September of 2016, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Up until the time of his arrest, at any point in time, did he indicate to you that something unusual had happened before he went on that fishing trip to Racine?
No.
Did he ever discuss with you a homicide that had happened off Hoffman Road of a young mother? Did that subject ever come up with him?
No.
I am going to ask if you could tell me, is Mr. Burch the person that you had been seeing? And let me rephrase that. Are you still in a relationship with Mr. Burch?
No.
Mr. Burch, you were having the relationship back in 2016. Is he in the courtroom?
Yes.
Could you tell me what he's wearing and where he's seated, please?
And to the right, he's wearing a blue shirt.
I'd ask the record to reflect identification of the defendant.
Record will reflect the witnesses identified the defendant in open court. Go ahead.
No further questions. Thank you.
All right. Cross-examination.
Hey, Jordan, just a few more questions for you, okay? When you were back in, I guess, May, June of 2016, were you aware that George bought some new shoes?
Yes.
Were you with him when he bought those shoes?
Yes.
You remember why he bought those shoes?
Because his other shoes were very bad.
What do you mean?
Like, they were dirty, there were holes in them. It just wasn't a good pair of shoes.
Did you make fun of him for them?
Yeah,
You think that might have had something to do with why he got new shoes?
probably.
That's the ex-girlfriend of George Burch, the defendant in the Nicole Vanderheiden murder case that we're covering here on the network. We do expect a live feed any moment. As soon as we have it, we'll make sure to go to it. But that is not the only case we're covering here today. We are also previewing, a new case out of Georgia that we believe will start next week. We think jury selection will begin on Monday. It's the case of Tex McIver, a prominent attorney who is charged with the killing of his wife. Now, he's claiming it was an accident. The state is calling it murder. We have a short preview of this case, and then we'll talk about it in a minute. Take a look.
The murder trial of a prominent Atlanta attorney is expected to start in just days. Claude Tex McIver, 74 years old, is charged with the 2016 shooting death of his wife, Diane. McIver was sitting behind Diane in the passenger seat of a car, and a friend was driving when he apparently opened fire, shooting Diane through her back. McIver claims the shooting was a mistake. This is what McIver's attorney told the judge at a bond hearing last year.
Mr. McIver had a pistol in his lap, and the pistol went off, or was accidentally fired. There was no argument, there was no quarrel. He was, according to Mr. Carter, he was asleep at the time. She stopped with a traffic light, and the first thing she heard was the explosion.
But prosecutors believe he had a financial motive to kill his wife. McIver is charged with malice murder, felony murder, and 5 other counts. We'll be streaming that trial starting Monday right here on the Law&Crime Network.
Again, we are going to be covering that case, and a very unusual case. Again, I'm here with criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Bob Bianchi. Bob, why do you have a gun in the car to begin with?
Well, you know, he's allowed to carry the weapon. Apparently, he had indicated at some point in time, I'm just telling you what we read in the news articles, that he was afraid of the rioting that had occurred, and he thought that there was actually a Black Lives Matter rally.
Didn't he not want that to get out, that's why he was having a gun?
But it's out. I mean, whether it's going to be admitted as evidence is another thing. Remember, as lawyers, we know a lot of facts on one side of our brain that don't necessarily get out to a jury on the other side. You got to always be careful of that. But, you know, listen, I don't know. That's what the guy says. I just find it a peculiar way to do this, because most people that are trying to stage a death either do it by somebody else did it, a third party did it, or a suicide. That's been my experience. Could it happen this way? And by the way, risk yourself driving a car, shooting a loaded firearm while somebody else is driving the vehicle and shocking them. I just find this unusual, although I also find it unusual that a firearm would just happen to go off in a vehicle too.
Well, who falls asleep while holding a loading weapon?
Yeah, but this is the reason why the state has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defense has to do nothing. They have to be the one that's going to straighten that out.
See, here's where I'll play devil's advocate. We covered the Todd Kenhammer case, a man who is convicted of killing his wife. Now, he was driving a car, and there was a pipe that went through a windshield, it fell off of a truck, and it impaled her. It hit her in the head. Excuse me, it didn't impale her, it hit her in the head. Now, he tried to say that was an accident, but there was such evidence to say that he planned this and he really did kill her.
Right.
So the question became there, if you're going to kill your wife, why go through such an elaborate scheme?
Yeah, but then again, remember, he was making it appear to the police as if it was an accident. The pipe fell off a truck, I believe.
A flatbed truck, right.
So he's not saying I did it, he's saying somebody else did it. And so I've never had a case, I'm just saying in 30 years, where a guy says, hey, I did it, but I did it by accident. Usually, again, like I say, it's either a third party did it, or it was the result of somebody else having committed a crime like a robbery, or the person committed suicide. And of all of those three, usually the fake suicide is the #1 way people will try to get away with it.
Well, I will tell you, Bob, we've covered the Bob Ward case here, and that was a man who also said that he shot his wife. He admitted it on a 911 phone call.
Right.
Said it was an accident. Didn't work out so well for him.
Yeah. Well, that's again a different
He was
situation.
convicted.
It was a heat of passion scenario. There was the wine all over the guy. There was evidence of a fight. Now, I'm not saying that there haven't been cases in which people are in the heat of the moment commit a crime and then say, "Hey, it was an accident." But that's not the situation. This is a guy driving in the vehicle with his best friend's wife driving, with his wife in the front seat. There's no argument going on. There's no heat of passion. So that separates, in my mind, that case from the other case.
So motive is not an element of a crime. The prosecution doesn't have to prove motive, but man, motive is good for a story. We love it here. What do you think the motive here that they're going to go with? That he wanted to protect his money from her, or there was some financial incentive? What do you get from this case so far?
Well, first, you're right, Jesse. The #1 way, prosecutors, motive. We love it, because it explains and puts into context their actions. But as you indicated, it's not necessary under the law to prove it, but you love it. All we have from this case is the statement that it was for financial reasons. We don't really understand yet what those specific financial reasons are. But, I've never been a big fan of the financial reason factor. Lots of people that are in marriages have, financial reasons, life insurance policies, so on and so forth. I'd like to see a motive much greater than that. I would hope for somebody who supposedly had a loving marriage for all those years.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. Again, that's a case of a prominent attorney who's charged with malice murder, felony murder, and a whole litany of crimes trying to suppress the statements of witnesses. Not looking good for somebody in the legal profession. We are waiting for our live feed here on the George Burch case out of Wisconsin, a major case that has captured the nation's attention. As soon as we do have that live feed in the courtroom, we're going to make sure to go to it. And today is going to be a very big day because the state will be wrapping up their case with important data and evidence. You're not going to want to miss anything. We'll take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Law&Crime Live, everybody. We're covering the George Burch case out of Wisconsin. As soon as we have a live feed in the courtroom, we're going to make sure to go to it. We don't want you to miss anything. But we are talking about what you might have missed in the last few days. And yesterday was the testimony of some friends that knew George Burch, knew him right when Nicole's disappeared and was ultimately found killed. What I want to play for you is the testimony of Edward Jackson, Burch's longtime friend, knew him for 20 years. And in fact, at this time, Burch was living with Ed and his wife, Linda. But what I'm playing for you right now is a discussion about the Chevrolet Blazer that Ed Jackson lent to George Burch. Now, the reason that's key is because the defense will say that Douglas Dietrich forced George Burch to drive Nicole's body in this Blazer. But that's not the only thing. This Blazer couldn't have been tested for DNA because it was damaged. It was set on fire. Coincidental? Let's listen in. This is, again, Ed Jackson from yesterday.
And when I say your vehicle, I'm referring to the red Blazer that you spoke of earlier, not the car you or your wife drove. Is that correct?
Correct.
Did the police come to your home?
Yes.
Is that how you first became aware of it?
Yes.
Following it, did you go view your vehicle once you made this discovery? Did you go take a look at the vehicle?
Yes.
And did you then observe any damage to the vehicle aside from fire damage?
Yes.
Where was that mainly?
The right front corner.
And did you see if in fact there was fire damage?
Yes.
And where did that appear to be?
Front seat.
Was it in the trunk? Was it in the engine area?
No. In the passenger compartment.
On June 8, 2016, the defendant was still living with you, is that correct?
Yes.
And he had his own bedroom, is that right?
Yes.
Did you allow him to bring women home? Did you have any rules against it?
No.
So that was a.
He could bring his girlfriend over or whatever.
Were there ever occasions that he did bring women home?
Yes.
You mentioned his girlfriend. Was there ever another occasion they brought anyone else home?
One little Asian girl that I don't know what her name was.
Okay. But you didn't have any problems with him having people come to his bedroom and stay over?
No.
Thank you. When the police had contact with you, was the defendant at your home also with respect to this inquiry into the hit and run?
Yes.
Were you present when they spoke with the defendant?
Yes.
Did they ask for anybody's phones?
Yes.
Ed and Linda Jackson let Burch sleep in their house. They bought him a train ticket to get to their house. They put him on their cell phone plan. They loaned him a car. He was backed up on rent payments and cell phone payments. Was this guy a good roommate? Bob, what do you think? Why is this important? Why is this important in this case? He was behind in his payments to them. They loaned him. They took him in. He lent the car. The car was eventually destroyed in a hit and run. Why is that important?
Well, there's lots of facets of the question you just asked. Why is the stuff other than the car was destroyed
Yeah, let's start with that.
important?
Why, besides the car, why was all the other stuff
Jesse,
important?
it's like I said to you before, I think this is superfluous information or extraneous information that's not relevant. And let's not forget that there's rules to the road at trials. They're called evidence rules. And sometimes when you're throwing all this bad character stuff out there, he didn't have a place to stay and he's bringing girls over to the house. This has no, in my opinion, relevance. The car has relevance, and prosecutors have to be concerned that if you throw all this extraneous bad character evidence out there, you know there's a bad character evidence rule, that the courts can reverse a conviction. And we speak about this all the time. When you prosecute a case, you don't just try it to win it, you try it that it can survive through the appellate division and the appellate process. How many cases do we cover that have been reversed because of prosecutorial error and brought back? And that makes the case harder to prove the next time for prosecutors.
The car is important for multiple reasons.
Sure.
One, it's because that's what the defense is saying he drove in the night in question and disposed the body of. It was also, it was destroyed, and they don't know who stole it or who was driving it when it was ultimately destroyed. Very coincidentally, Burch in the Nicole Vanderheiden murder.
Right, so they extracted, he cooperated, Burch cooperated with the police, allowed them to extract data from his phone. The police not knowing that he was going to ultimately be connected to this murder, and down the road when the cops made the connection to the car and using the cell phone data, so on and so forth, they went and retrieved the data from the first investigation, that is the car being stolen and burned, and used it in this prosecution to show the various points that he was connected to the victim, including the place where she was buried. And there was an argument by the defense that that was improper for the police to have done.
Yeah.
It's not improper, but I'll tell you, when I was a prosecutor, we would get a controlled data warrant, a CDW we would call it. I would have done that just to protect that evidence from appeal down the road. In other words, I go to another judge and I say, Judge, this data was collected in this one case. Yeah. From a cell phone, and we want to use it in this case. There would be no doubt a judge would give you the CDW for that.
I'm surprised. I completely understand that. Bob, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this case. We really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Jesse.
Thank you. All right, everybody, we are waiting for our live feed in the George Burch case out of Wisconsin. There's a lot at stake here for this man. Again, he is charged with first-degree intentional homicide in connection with the death of a young mother. And this seems to be overwhelming evidence against him. And despite all that, the defense is saying he didn't do it. It was the boyfriend, Douglas Dietrich. As soon as we have a live feed, we'll make sure to go to it. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute. Stay tuned.